Museum in New York, am I right, sir?
That's right.
And what about the Museum of Modern Art as well?
That's right. The Metropolitan is probably the most comprehensive in the United States. It has art from a period of about 5,000 years, where the Museum of Modern Art is from the late 1800s. And other art museums or galleries are the Chicago Art Museum, the Fogg Museum in Boston, and a rather interesting one also in New York is the Guggenheim. And the building is almost as interesting as the displays, because the displays are all arranged on a kind of spiral, and you move upward or downward, I suppose, through the building as you view it.
今日は museums ということでお話をしておりますが、well, back to talking about American museums, and when I visited Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago, there was another museum, but it was not called a museum. It was called something like institution. And
yes, I think probably you're talking about the Smithsonian Institution.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. This one is unique in that, for one thing, it's run by a branch of the federal government. The Board of Regents includes senators and congressmen, the vice president, the chief justice, and, of course, most of the decisions about the displays are actually made by a group of private citizens serving. The Smithsonian was started by an Englishman, actually, James Smithson, who, when he died, donated his fortune to the United States. It's not just one museum, it's actually a collection of many museums. The National Air and Space Museum, National Museum of Natural History, there's an art gallery, even a zoo, and there's also a branch of the museum called the Smithsonian Institute that does research.
That sounds a little bit like the Science Museum or the London's Natural History Museum, which has displays of natural phenomena such as volcanoes. It explains how the weather works, and it has the history of man, and also it has a lot of enormous stuffed animals. Did you see those, Mr. Toja?
Yes, actually, when I visited it, I mean the one in London, Natural History Museum, I was really impressed with the stuffed elephants standing right ahead of us as we walked in, and they were really something. And I didn't see anything like that before.
No, they're enormous.
Mm-hmm. And the National Air and Space Museum was also impressive, and I'm sure it's part of the Smithsonian Institution, am I right?
That's right. I think it began in around 1946, and it has aircraft all the way from the Wright brothers and the Kitty Hawk Flyer right up to the Apollo 11. Some of the spacecraft that we can see there actually went into space and landed on the moon. Others are sort of backup ships. They may not build just one craft at a time, but maybe two of them. And in some cases, it is actually the one that went into space. In other cases, it's an exact duplicate.
Yes, that's absolutely marvelous. I mean, the National Air and Space Museum, and I was really impressed with its incredibly large collection of aircraft when I visited it a couple of years ago. And when we talk about museums in the world, probably we cannot do so without referring to the British Museum, which I also found incredibly impressive. Michael is probably tempted to make some comment on this at this point.
That's right. Well, it's another very large museum, and you shouldn't really try to see too much at once, but you should go back several visits. One of my favorite things there is the classical antiquities, such as Greek sculptures, and the Parthenon frieze, which comes from the Acropolis in Athens. And then, apart from the British Museum, all over the country there are very small little folk museums or special interest museums, such as transport museums or a costume museum. And then again, in England and Scotland, we have a lot of castles and stately homes, many of which are open to the public and are very interesting museums for their own sake and for the collection of art that they have.
それからまあ 私どもの the man who donated funds originally was called James Smithson, a British. Well, and when we visit a museum or an art gallery, there should be something we should keep in mind in terms of the sort of things we should do and we should not do. I mean, do's and don'ts, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And what are they, do you think, Sue?
Well, my first warning, I think, would be about maybe taking pictures. In many places, taking pictures, even if you have no flash, is not allowed. It's very distracting to the other people. And also, most museums will sell pictures of some of the displays, and this, of course, helps to support the museum. Also, we shouldn't be touching things in the museum. Although there are museums nowadays, I think particularly those which were left behind by World's Fairs, where it's intended that children play with the exhibits. So if you have small children, look for that type of museum. But still in the traditional museums, can you think of some other rules?
Well, as you said, not touching, they're very strict about. Also, you shouldn't take food in. Children with ice creams are not too popular in museums.
Mm.
What else, Sue?
Usually we don't talk very loudly in a museum, particularly an art museum.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes our hand luggage is subject to a security check, so you must be prepared for that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And now, for the rest of the time, let's talk about some useful expressions. And the first thing that comes to my mind, connecting with museum, is something is a museum piece, or somebody could be a museum piece. And what do you mean by that?
That's quite a jocular expression.
Mm.
I would say it about some of my friends' cars, for example. If they're very old and rusty and bad condition, you think they should be put in a museum. But you don't mean it literally, of course.
That's right. A word associated with museums is the curator. That's the director of the museum. Of course, there are many volunteers who work at the museum, too.
Okay. それから表現に関しましては、ミュージアムピースという言葉がありますね。で、これはとっても古いというところから、日本語でももうこれは博物館行きですねとか、そういうことを冗談で言いますが、こういうふうに冗談でよく使われる表現ですね。それからキュレーター、これも博物館に関係をした用語ですね。What about docent?
I don't think this is an expression used in England, but in America, the docent is the volunteer who works, perhaps takes people on a tour of the museum. Often these are people who have studied art or history and are not working in that profession, but like to keep a finger in it.
Mm-hmm. So a curator is definitely a professional.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, friends, this concludes today's program, and if you have a chance of visiting either America or England, be sure to visit those museums. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
担当は東後勝明先生。